So I'm starting off with the salt technique, and salt, as you can see here, creates some amazing light textures, and you always have to allow the salt to dry naturally. But I'm going to show you different timings and different salts to use which create different effects as well. So let's get started. So I started off with a violet wash. I'm just taking a little pinch of table salt, sprinkling it evenly onto the very wet puddle of watercolour paint. I'm going to do the same with the Himalayan salt on the right hand side into the puddle there. I'm just going to allow that to dry naturally. Meanwhile, I want the centre of this wash now for the shine to go off a little bit, so it's damp, and I'm going to sprinkle some salt onto the damp surface, which is the time I would recommend students to apply it. So I've applied table salt on the left and the Himalayan salt on the right as I'm doing there, and we'll allow that to dry naturally. As you can see, it's drying off now and the paper is still damp, so I'm actually putting some table salt on the left and some Himalayan salt on the right, and I'm going to allow them to dry naturally, which could take several hours. So at the top it's very wet, in the middle it's damp, and at the bottom it's drying off. So I'm rubbing off with my paper towel. So here is the painting dried, and you can see the difference at the top there. The salt's exploded literally, and it's not got a lot of shape. In the middle it's got better shape, especially the Himalayan salt on the right hand side. I'm quite pleased with the salt on the bottom left. That was the table salt. The Himalayan salt didn't work quite well on the right hand side, so it's quite interesting the different effects you get from different types of salt, but also the different times that you put them on, when it's very wet or when it's sort of damp or when it's drying off. So I really encourage you to have a little practice trying out the different salts and the different timings. The next technique I'm going to use in this tutorial is the plastic card technique, and as you can see here, I cut up the card in all different sizes, and as you can see here, I use the sort of flat side here, but I also use the point of the plastic card as well. So it's so useful and versatile and free. So I'm going to use the side of the card now to swipe off the watercolour paint. And I've waited for the top one to dry off a bit now. You can still see there's a sheen there. And I'm just sort of almost like a windscreen wipe. I'm sort of swiping. If you can see here, I'm going to demonstrate that there. Swiping. Do it quite swiftly and don't labour it. Don't go back and forth, because you can tear your paper and it can look quite muddy. I'm using the corner, the sharp corner of the card as I'm pointing to here, and I'm lifting off quite swiftly to reveal thin white lines. So I'm lifting off that watercolour paint. So now I'm going to use the rounded corner of the plastic card and do the same thing, lifting off swiftly, and you get sort of larger marks, larger grasses. So it really is an effective tool for creating and painting grasses and rocks. And next I'm going to be using some framing tape. I'm just ripping up my framing tape, but you could use masking tape for this as well. So just pinch it at the end and then just tear it. It does take a bit of practice, I'm not going to lie to you, and a lot of my students who did this, I had to kind of sort of lead them through it, but you just kind of pinch at the top and just tear. You saw there, I didn't do it very well, but all those little bits you can save for little skinnier trees in the background. So just practice it and be patient, and it doesn't really matter. You just need to have some bits stuck here and there. So I'm just sort of placing them here and there, the smaller skinny ones sort of further back, and I'm going to actually place some larger masking tape or framing tape more in the foreground, so you really create depth in your painting. Before you do any of this, do test that your tape doesn't tear the paper. So put a bit on the paper, take it off. If it tears, don't use that paper. And if you don't have any other paper, use masking fluid instead, or paint around the trees. Next, I'm using a spattering technique. I'm mixing up a puddle of colour here. You do need plenty of colour for spattering. So I'm starting with that, loading my brush. As you can see, I'm holding the brush firmly in my painting hand and tapping with my index finger on my left hand there, really holding the brush firm. Don't let it move up and down. Try to keep it horizontal if you can. I'm also now tapping with my index finger of my painting hand. I quite like spattering this way, but it does take a little practice. Another method my students quite like is to tap using another brush perhaps, and tap your loaded paintbrush against the brush and you get some nice results. You can also use a toothbrush for spattering. So this is an old toothbrush and I've mixed up a puddle of paint. Really load your toothbrush and rub your finger against the bristles there, and do that sort of horizontal to the paper as well, and you get some lovely results. See how I'm going closer there? You get a lovely fine mist, and if you really load your brush and sort of flick at it, you get some really random size blobs, large, medium, small. The only thing is this is quite messy and it does go everywhere. One thing about spattering is make sure you mask around your working area as well. But here's a close-up. As you can see, I've got lots of different size blobs, creating lots of textures. And for my next technique, I'm going to be using a twig. That's a twig straight from the garden that I've sharpened with a pencil sharpener, and I'm just mixing up now a puddle of paint, and I'm dipping the twig now into that paint, really loading it, and I'm drawing these thin lines. The twig is great for drawing thin lines. I find the twig quite useful because it almost feels like you're drawing with a pencil that, you know, the paint, the liquid's coming out of almost. And the nice thing about this, you can just lean in with the twig and it's sort of more secure. But I really do feel like you need to make a puddle. The other thing, another bit of advice, if you don't feel the twig's working, I find just leaving my twig in a pot of water, you know, a little while to soak before I start using it. It seems to hold on and soak up the paint better. So as you can see here, I'm just drawing in these very thin stems with this sort of light brown colour. So if you have shaky hands and you're worried about drawing very thin lines, why not try practicing with the twig? You may surprise yourself. So this is a quick beginner's silver birch tutorial where I use all 5 techniques. So the first technique is using the framing tape. You can use masking tape, and I'm sticking it to the watercolour paper. Mixing up some colours now. I've mixed up a little bit of cadmium yellow with a touch of red just at the bottom there, a little bit of red and crimson here, mixing up some autumnal colours. So this is a little bit of crimson with a touch of lamp black, just mixing up a puddle there, wetting the paper with a 1-inch soft flat brush here, really giving it a good soak. The longer you wet it, the more time it gives you to paint. I'm actually starting off with a little bit of Cerulean here, using my size 8 round soft head brush. I'm painting wet in wet here. The little paint box I'm using is the Field Box by Winsor & Newton, and I will put a link for a tutorial I made all about this paint box in the description below. This is a little bit of a lemon yellow with a touch of that cadmium yellow. I've actually used a touch of orange in there as well. I have swapped some of the colours that they didn't all originally come in this Field Box. I've got a touch of burnt sienna, a little bit of crimson here, so you can really be experimental with your colours, have fun with them. Mix up puddles and just paint them wet into wet. All around the trees there, the masking tape or framing tape will actually reserve the white of the paper, so you can really let go and have some fun. Be almost abstract as well with your paint. Just painting these colours wet into wet, using these lovely autumnal colours. I've added a little bit of ultramarine and burnt sienna here with a touch of crimson, painting that damp into wet there, and mixing up a little bit more of that alizarin crimson with a tiny touch of the black, and painting damp into damp. What happens with damp into damp is the paint doesn't run so much, so it stays put. Wet into wet, the paint really runs and blends together more. This is actually a palette knife. You can use a plastic card, which I showed you earlier, and you can use a palette knife to lift off the paint the same way I used to lift off with a plastic card. And I'm using my twig now, sharpened with a pencil sharpener, used here to apply some of the thick creamy paint, damp into damp, to paint these very thin sort of twigs and branches here, using very dark creamy paint, working damp into damp. Going back with my palette knife, again you can use the plastic card to create these lovely light grasses here and there. I'm also going to use the palette knife to lift off some lighter branches as well. Just make sure the painting isn't too wet or too dry. You need it sort of damp with a sheen on there so that you can lift off easier. And as you can see there, it's quite effective. And I'm just sort of applying now some sea salt onto the damp paper, and I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. And as you can see, the salts absorb some of the paint to create these lovely light textures. They look like little wild flowers. So I'm carefully removing the tape. Now, the paper has torn. This can happen. Unfortunately, it has happened to this painting, but not to worry. I'm going to create textures with that. So I'm actually applying very thick dark paint here, a mixture of black and burnt sienna. A list of materials that I'm using can be found in the description below, along with the colours and alternative colours. But I'm just sort of painting these marks, these very characteristic marks that you find on silver birch trees with my size 6 round brush. And the texture of the torn paper is actually adding to the sort of really lovely texture of the trees. However, I wouldn't suggest tear your paper deliberately. I'm actually painting a little bit of shadow colour, so I've watered down that black and burnt sienna now and just painting this shadow colour over the damp paint. So the light's coming from the left and all the shadows are on the right hand side there. So keep the white and light of the paper on the left. Just painting a few darker grasses underneath the tree there, using a touch of black with a tiny touch of cadmium yellow there, using my size 6 round brush. And I'm just using my rigger brush now to apply a few more branches here and there. And of course, finishing off with a spatter, I'm using the rigger to spatter some orange, some yellow ochre here and there in the foliage and on the ground as well. You can use some of the leftover paint in your palette as well. I'm using the twig again just to apply a few more darks. You can just use black straight from the pan. I usually give my pans a little spritz half an hour before I use them so you can get a little bit more paint from them, and just continue on painting these marks, touch of burnt sienna here and there as well, to create these characteristic marks on the silver birch trees just to finish off the painting. And here is the finished painting where I've used all 5 of those techniques. I really hope it inspires you to maybe paint a similar painting or something of your own using these techniques. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you will get updates of my latest tutorials. And for exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.